Joining me today is Max Beyer, pharma reporter at Endpoints News and one of the sharpest voices in pharma policy, pricing, the biotech world, you name it. If you've seen the viral clip by now of Trump yesterday in his press event where he promised to drop the price of the bet shot to $150, that moment was actually started with Max's question. Max's work over at Endpoints has been way ahead of the curve on everything from MFN, most favored nation drug pricing, to the political tug of war that's shaping the future of GLP-1 access, specifically for obesity in America. So Max isn't just writing about the drug industry. He's actually talking to the people, including the president of the United States, who are actually moving it. And today we get to hear what it was like to actually be in the room and push that question that single-handedly shook the entire global obesity market. Let's welcome in Max Beyer from Endpoints. Max, welcome to On the Pin.
Hello, great to be here. We've been chatting for more than a year now, and I just love, getting your thoughts on this topic and bouncing ideas off of you. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invite.
Oh, absolutely. That's a two-way street, man. That's a two-way street. Yesterday was crazy. So first of all, you blew up the internet, the entire internet. So what is it like to be like to go from Endpoints reporter to like viral social media star?
Super strange, man, because, I love our outlet. We're also sort of a bit of a specialty outlet focused on pharma. So, I'm working with like drug makers all the time, but there's not, I guess, like a lot of like viral moments that even arise in
Right.
my work. So it's been funny to get some texts from like friends and family who are like, you just like stumbled upon my TikTok. And I'm like, cool. Or like people who are like, oh, I saw this clip like 3 times, but I didn't realize that was you until like the 3rd or 4th time. So it's been fun and very humbling. And, like the journalism student in me is happy and excited.
Yeah, that's amazing. What a moment. Yeah, I was in a Chuck E. Cheese with all 4 of my kids, and my phone starts blowing up, and I'm like, oh my goodness, like I got to take 2 minutes to go cover this. This is huge. Of course, we've been following like MFN and like there's so much that we can get into on that point, but yeah, I'm at a Chuck E. Cheese and like I put this video out and then like 10 minutes later, I get a text from Max and he's like, hey, that was your boy. And I was like, what? How did I even miss that? But I had just, I was trying to work quick, but amazing. So first of all, I mean, I just have to ask you in a Trump administration, I mean, even just objectively, it's got to be quite an experience to cover the Trump administration. There's been so many changes. You're talking about, some very interesting characters that are now, at the head and the helm of these medical positions within the government. Just from a human perspective, Max, what's it been like to cover this administration and just try to extract information that people are going to find value in?
It's been exciting. It's been exhausting. It's been hard to discern at times, which I think can be applied to a few different policies, which isn't an indictment of like the administration's attempt to tackle them. But, I think like a lot of things have been fast moving and sort of to be revealed. And I think MFN is sort of one of those.
Well, they're doing a lot.
Right.
Just period. They're doing a lot.
And we didn't know, right? And I think worth reminding folks, like we didn't, when Trump announced the MFN ambition, which I think came in like a May EO, and then there was obviously the late July letters, I think we were all sort of asking like, what would the final product look like? And so I think we're like learning now in real time that at least for now, it's going to be these maybe one-off agreements with select companies that were highlighted by the president to, come to the table, and they might have specialized deals tailored to them. And obviously, the news about Ozempic came at an event about EMD Serono, which is working on fertility, which has a portfolio of fertility treatments, and their MFN deal sort of centers on those. So like we're already getting a sense of maybe how these are going to differ from one company to the next. And I think my job as a reporter is to try and learn about that maybe before the president stands up there, and it can be a little hard. I mean, kudos to the administration. I think they've been pretty tight-lipped about it until the announcement comes. So it's been a roller coaster, but it's kind of what you sign up for.
Yeah, absolutely. Just so much going on at any given point. And for our audience, we're myopically focused on obesity medicine here. So like it's not as overwhelming to try to stay on top of the news every day. But when you're covering the broader pharmaceutical industry, there's just a lot of things to keep up with. And I think you said it well. Like when you look at how this is actually materializing, because that was always the question, right? With an executive order, you're
Mm-hmm.
now working. They tried this at the end of their first administration, but they didn't have the IRA framework to kind of work MFN within. Now they do. And so it was always like with an EO, it's all just going to depend on who you can get to the table and how, right? Because
Yep.
there's no real teeth behind it other than just the levers of government power that they can kind of wield over these companies. So let's talk a little bit, because there's a bunch of stuff that we can and will get into, but let's talk a little bit about yesterday specifically. So you kind of teed it up. There was a Trump administration talking about, something related to MFN in terms of some medication for fertility. And then from there, what kind of happens? Just set up the scene for us.
Right. So Trump was sort of in his intro about the event. He sort of spoke first, and then in his description of what he was about to announce as part of the broader MFN pursuit, he alluded to a drug that was $1,300 here, much cheaper in the UK, and he said he didn't name the drug at the time, but he said, we're going to be paying about $150 here, and they'll, Europe and the UK, they'll pay $150. So, the alarm starts to go off in my head. I'm thinking this is a weight loss drug, but he didn't say it, right? And I think like sometimes my goal, whether it's Trump or anyone else, is to be as specific as possible in the moment, because that is something that I can kind of start writing and reporting on. So the event then sort of continues. It focuses on EMD Serono and these fertility treatments. The gaggle of reporters then starts to open up. We get the opportunity to ask questions. And I just was referring back to what the president had mentioned at the top. And so I just was sort of like regurgitating his own words back to him just to make sure I was sort of understanding him and interpreting him correctly. And so that's why my question was, you had mentioned this $1,300 drug. Were you referring to the weight loss drugs? And he confirmed, yes, I was talking about Ozempic. And so then I was like, okay, so those are going to be about $150 out of pocket. And I'm thinking in this moment, is this Trump essentially sort of letting the cat out of the bag on the MFN discussions with Lilly and Novo to some degree? I guess you could think about it specifically for Novo since it was Ozempic. But I'm sort of thinking about both companies because they are sort of running in parallel, at least on the MFN discussions.
Right.
And he says, they will be much lower. And so I think there is some interpretation there maybe of whether he meant much lower than 1,300, much lower than 150. Clearly, though, like this 150 number is something he had mentioned at the top and that I was sort of using as a baseline. Dr. Mehmet Oz, the administrator of CMS, who's actually been in charge of leading these negotiations, and his deputies under him, had to sort of correct the president that we were not there yet in the negotiation process. Because I think, to be fair to Dr. Oz, I think he understood what I was getting at. He sort of understood the sharkishness of a reporter. And so he steps in and says, we haven't gotten there. And so I was then asking, okay,
well, he's also the one who has to run these conversations
right.
Back and forth with these companies, not necessarily Trump.
Exactly right. So, he's weighing a few other things. I think Trump is in a way fairly being like, look, I'm interested in these announcements that you're seeing, and I want us to get there. But Mehmet Oz is the guy at the table. He's also the guy on the receiving end, as he's alluded to in the past, from the late night text from the president and about making sure these things get done. So have
you ever, in your experience covering it, have you ever seen anybody interrupt Trump that way? Because it was like, you could tell like he all but pushed him out of the way of the microphone.
Yeah, I think that took me a little bit by surprise. But I saw him sort of wanting to engage. And so, at that point I was like, okay, well, whether Trump answers or Oz answers it, I think both would be valuable. So at the point at which he clarified the status of the negotiations, I was like, okay, well, what do I want to learn next? I want to learn timing. So I was like, okay, well, what's the time frame here? Yeah. And I think they didn't want to like show their cards too much on that, but the president again sort of, was like, well, this is, going to happen soon. I think it'll happen soon, I think was what he said. And I think that's when Oz says, these negotiations will continue until the president is happy. So take that for what you will, whether that's ultimately 150, whether that's,
just
something else.
Ozempic,
Right.
right?
Just Ozempic, maybe.
Because he kind of went from Ozempic to the fat shot, and it seems like he's called the fat shot, used that as a placeholder for different drugs along the way,
Right.
in different, so again, kind of hard to track with exactly what he's talking about, but there's a ton of moving parts here, right? And this is where I think for patients, again, when I'm kind of reeling this back into On the Pen, and those who follow us are people living with the disease of obesity, and accessibility is the number one topic. Like, we can have conversations about innovation and future medications, and will bringing prices down in MFN stifle innovation, yada, yada, yada. I think from the community's perspective, is like, all the innovation in the world doesn't matter if people can't access the drug.
100%.
And so I think this is where people, like, really their ears perk up to the content that we cover here. So in the context of most favored nation and the potential for, let's just call it affordable or more affordable obesity medicine for patients, specifically within the confines of Medicare, but presumably if it follows the track of some of these other announcements from AstraZeneca and Pfizer, and you may ultimately see that their direct cash pay price comes down on these medications as well.
Yep.
There's a lot going on. So I'm thinking about all the things that Eli Lilly wants right now. If you could just like zoom out for a second with me. So we know that Eli Lilly is right now suing the FDA over the classification of retatrutide, their future blockbuster in obesity and metabolic health. They're suing to get that classified as a biologic, which would do a couple of things for Eli Lilly. It would extend the protection on their patent, right, from 5 years to, I believe, 12 years on a biologic. It would, most importantly, I think for patients, it would, if they were to classify this as a biologic, it would mean sort of a rewriting of the interpretation of what classifies a biologic. So then you may have a broader conversation about other compounded GLP-1s. But even if it's just retatrutide, it means that if it's classified that way, it cannot ever be compounded, which is a huge fight that Lilly and Novo. And then there's also the enforcement over compounding currently. And so you have a lot of things that Lilly wants from the government. Do you think that cheaper obesity medicine vis-a-vis MFN is really something that's within grasp here, or is it political theater, or is it a little bit of both?
I mean, I don't, I'll sort of give my diplomatic answer. A lot remains to be seen, but I think that clearly getting the price of those, as yesterday illuminated, let's just, again, go back to the president's words explicitly. It's a focus for him to get the price of these drugs down. And if we want to just focus on Ozempic in the context of his comments, totally fine. But I think he's mentioned Ozempic and the fat loss drugs like previously, right? So they're like at the top of his head, right? Like he knows what they are. He knows their price discrepancies. Like, this is a focus for him. So I would be hesitant to say it's political theater, because again, we are seeing these deals get announced, and I don't think that EMD Serono is going to be the last one. So I think we're going to see something in the future that involves Lilly or Novo or both with respect to MFN.
And you would expect within these conversations, because the kind of the elephant in the room is that obesity medicines are not allowed to be covered by Medicare. And while the Biden administration had a rule kind of in place at the end of their administration, the Trump administration sort of dropped it in the spring, presumably because they wanted to fold that into the conversations about bringing the cost down. Are you seeing that the same way?
That I would interpret it that way, right? I mean, it's a negotiating tool for the government. You play ball with us on list price reductions. We'll play ball with you on maybe on Medicare access. You can imagine these may be, and I want to be clear, like, this isn't explicit reporting that I have, but you can imagine in a world where that's part of the negotiation and the tactic. The government wants all of the tools at its disposal. So, for the GLP-1s, and this is why they're an interesting case in and of themselves, there's a lot more things that the government has actually at its disposal to get them to the table, and that the Lillys and the Novos of the world might be asking for, that the Pfizers or the AstraZenecas or the other large pharmas might not really care about as much beyond the tariff threat. So I think tariffs were the main application, and you've seen that in these announcements where RFK, HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., has been thanking Howard Lutnick for his help to get these companies and these deals through the finish line. So tariffs now are sort of indefinitely paused for everyone while the MFN deals continue. But for the GLP-1 drugs, you have the want of the companies to have Medicare cover it for obesity, at least for some amount of the population. And remember, too, recall that RFK said in an interview early on in this administration that they were considering that still, but it might be sort of more gated where people have to try sort of diet and exercise, maybe they try something else, and then maybe, so I think remains to be seen whether it's like full-fledged. And then the other thing, to your point, is I wonder if there is a part of the conversation involving compounding and enforcement of compounders, or vice versa. If the government is saying, like, if you don't reduce the price by this amount, like, well, nothing we can really do about that, so there's the conversation is wider, I think, in terms of what the government has to offer up, what the Lilly and Novo are asking for, and ultimately maybe what is combined in an MFN deal. Oh, and by the way, as we were sort of talking before we went on, for Novo specifically, Ozempic is on the IRA Medicare negotiation list. That is a mandatory negotiation. And this week was the statutory deadline for the government to submit final proposals. And I think the companies have until the end of the month to accept or reject that. So Novo specifically has an additional ball in the air with the IRA negotiations. And I think that's also sort of maybe complicating and clouding progress on MFN.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because that was going to be my next question is sort of Novo and Lilly are in two very unique positions. And we talked also from Lilly's side, how you get the announcement from Pfizer on their direct cash pay. They show the list of medications that they're going to, cut in half or 80% reductions. I think Lilly's probably sitting at the table going, hey, President Trump, we did this before it was, this, sort of executive order.
Yeah.
We went direct to consumers. We cut the price from list in half for our blockbuster medications. Like, what do we get out of the deal? So it'll be interesting to see specifically how Novo, I think that you may see a much more significant reduction on the Novo side, again, because Ozempic's part of the IRA mandatory drug negotiations, as you pointed out, where Lilly has a little bit different position. But Lilly has a lot of things, like I was outlining before, that they want out of the Trump administration. So I hope that ultimately it's a good deal. But I've seen this the same way that you have from the beginning, is that even though this was an executive order, and I mean, a lot of the pushback that I got back, it's hard to separate the wheat from the chaff from the good questions that people have, because everything is so political, right? But just zooming out from the patient perspective, I thought that this had the power, because of the framework of the IRA, to actually have some teeth to it. And it's been interesting to see who has come to the table on this. One other thing, we got like a minute and a half left before I need to cut you out. Curious what your thoughts are. So one of the things that I thought Lilly had maybe going into this, that they may be wanting from the Trump administration out of an MFN deal, would be that the Trump administration would grant a priority review voucher, not the traditional one, but this new like 1 month to 2 month approval for orforglipron, their new oral GLP-1, because I know they want to be first to market with an obesity pill, right? We've got high dose Wegovy coming from Novo Nordisk, probably sometime at the beginning of next year. But I would have thought that Lilly really wanted to fight to be first to market on an obesity pill. That was announced yesterday, and they are not on that list. There are no obesity medications on that list. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that came into play here at all, or not so much?
It's a good question. And I've been I had been through sort of some of your videos that I've been watching in the last couple of months. I was picking up on this sort of conversation that was happening and suspicion about at Orpho. If I'm honest with you, I haven't really had the same hunch that it would be included. It might yet. I don't know if the company has submitted it. I don't think they've been clear about that. For what it's worth, the commissioner said that there's going to be more. I spoke to McCary briefly outside of the White House yesterday, and he said they're going to be on a rolling basis. He said in an FDA Direct video that there's going to be, maybe a second batch that's announced in the coming weeks. So I think I would certainly anticipate that that's before the end of the year. We'll see. Here's what I would just maybe say about Lilly and Orpho. Like, the one thing that they might have, and this is sort of up and down, right? Like maybe they want to participate in this, or maybe this is the exact reason they wouldn't want to do the commissioner's vouchers. The commissioner has said that there's 3 pillars here that apply and that they're applying to the vouchers. One is unmet need, one is the price of the drug, and the third is domestic manufacturing. So you could see a world in which Lilly would like the voucher from an expedited standpoint, but maybe they don't want to make price concessions on orforglipron that the commissioner might request to get it. Just throwing out that sort of topic of conversation. The other thing is, frankly, and I don't mean to sort of poo-poo the innovation that could have on sort of the oral market, but you could also envision an administration and an FDA which has been both sort of touting, but also has had moments of hesitancy about the weight loss drugs, of sort of really not seeing it that innovative, and I don't know, but I would sort of put that in people's heads as well, as what have we picked up from this administration about, no pun intended, but their appetite for weight loss medications, right? It's been hard to pick up, I think sometimes you hear a comment that makes it seem like, they are displeased with their use in pediatrics, or it being sort of a crutch for people who don't have a healthier lifestyle. And at the same time, I think people recognize that they're a huge boon and for MFN, right? They're going to be key to driving traffic to Trump RX. So there's things to consider. And I think that the FDA is probably weighing in terms of what is genuinely innovative. And then from Lilly's side, it's what is it worth the concessions that they might have to make to get, 7 or 8 additional months on the market? Very
interesting. Last point and question for you on Orpho. So first of all, I would think that sitting on, they said upwards of $500 million worth of sellable doses of Orpho that
that's right. Yeah.
They're pretty eager to get that thing to market. But second of all, do you think that there's a concern on Lilly's part, all clinical data and efficacy aside, do you think that there's a concern that in the interim, Orpho could cannibalize tirzepatide sales at a moment where they're really, really kind of driving their heels into Wegovy? There was some data today on Wegovy scripts dropping by about 4% in the last period. I can't remember
that the orals would cannibalize the injectable market.
Yeah. To some extent.
My hot take has been that the opposite could happen in a way where there actually might be a smaller market for the orals in a world where there's a cheaper DTC or even just once these go generic, that for I've had frankly the opposite take. I've been sort of cautious about the sales potential of the oral GLP-1 market in a world where the injectables are much cheaper
and much more efficacious.
Right. They're more efficacious. I think people sort of have a clearer sense now of what the GI side effect profile looks like. There's less surprises in that. So people, I think, are clear-eyed when they're taking those drugs. Theoretically, they're only going to get cheaper over time, and let's see what potential MFN prices look like for them. But this all obviously really depends. It's hard to speculate without knowing what the price of Orpho is. But if Orpho is more expensive than the injectables, which I don't know, because theoretically, right, it's easier to make because it's just a tablet, but it all comes down to price. But I've been sort of thinking that when you combine the efficacy with potential lower pricing of the injectables, that I'm not necessarily completely sold on an oral market going crazy immediately, especially if it just restarts insurance coverage issues again. Because correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, but my understanding of 2025 is that sort of slowly but surely insurers are sort of they're including some of the GLP-1s a little bit. Yes, no, maybe so.
I'm honestly seeing both to about the same degree. I'm seeing folks that are losing coverage in the coming calendar year, and I'm seeing people that are gaining it. The people that are gaining it seem to be gaining it with you kind of couched this administration's position on covering obesity for Medicare and we want to see lifestyle modifications. So I'm seeing coverage being added in some cases, but it's you're also going to get a scale and you're going to have to use our program and you're going to have to check in and things like that. So I don't know. I think that the GLP-1s have really forced the cash pay issue and highlighted the issue with pharmacy benefit managers in this country and the price of prescription drugs in general, in a way that, I think it took a disease like obesity that affects 100 million people in the US to really, it's not like we didn't know the system was broken before, but I think because it affects so many people who are trying to take these medications, who have seen the benefits either through compounded versions or they've had a friend who's seen benefit, it's just highlighted a lot of brokenness within the system. And so it's really driven this direct cash pay, which has changed the dynamics. Compounding has changed the dynamics of, I think, even payer uptake of these medications, because, if you think about, we know that 80 million doses of compound semaglutide were sold last year alone. Like that number comes from one of the lawsuits that the OFA brought against the FDA over compounding. You think about that, that's millions of patients on compounded versions of GLP-1s. Those are millions of patients who aren't going to their employer saying, gosh darn it, I'm going to go find a different job if you don't cover obesity medicine because I need access.
Right.
They've been comfortable with the compound. So I think from Lilly and Novo's perspective, that's been part of this whole compound conversation is just the lack of people being up in arms about not getting covered because they have this sort of easier option.
Well, and I'll sort of wrap it up here, and just to bring it home too on the and just to bounce off that thought, because I think this is so important to hammer home. When we have talked and reported on Trump RX and the DTC effort, we have caveated it every time by saying, like, the vast majority of Americans get their, the vast majority of Americans are on insurance and they get their drugs through insurance. And so we don't really know what the cash pay market is going to look like for an immunology drug or maybe a neuropsych drug, whatever, except for the GLP-1s.
Compounds.
Right. And the compounds, the GLP-1s. So, like, the reason why I think that each side has some leverage here, right? Like, the government has the levers to pull to get the companies to the table, but the companies have the leverage of saying, like, we know that with these on Trump RX, or you directing people to our DTC programs, like, that's going to actually almost automatically drive demand, because people are doing that already through the compounds, through the telehealth, through Lilly and Novo's existing DTC markets. So it's this very fascinating sort of sub dynamic within the broader MFN talks, because I think both sides sort of realize and recognize the power that they have, but that the other has. I would imagine that they come to an agreement about something, but that's why it's so hard to figure out what it might be, because there are so many different mechanisms. But I think what I've maintained in my head throughout is that, and when I talk to people, like, I really do feel like the success of Trump RX, and by success, I just mean traffic to the website, like actual utilization, hinges so much on the price of the GLP-1s, because, again, they have the demand for cash pay already. And it's much more of a question mark about whether other people are going to go onto Trump RX for a drug that they might be covered for insurance, and for which maybe the cash pay is cheaper, but maybe it's not. And so, but the GLP-1s are sort of the alternative there.
Yeah. The great equalizer. Well, Max, this has been an excellent conversation. Keep asking these questions, because I know between the earnings calls and these press gaggles, it seems like everything that gets asked is either for investors or it's for medical professionals, and the patients are over here going, when are we going to get access? When are we going to get relief? So on behalf of everyone in our community, I just want to thank you for asking that question today and being there and being another voice that's just helping people get information, right? Because when people have better information, they have better conversations with their doctors and better health outcomes. So I appreciate all you're doing, Max.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. And I look forward to staying in touch. Hopefully there's more news to talk about in the future.
I'm hoping so. Thanks again, Max.
Thanks.